Thanks in part to digital distribution, over the last decade or so we have seen a rise in the number of smaller game development studios, otherwise known as indie. It would also seem that there has been a steady increase of first-person shooters we know and remember with great fondness. One such recent creation is Dusk. Quite a number of previous works have been influential in its development, and these include Quake, Doom, Hexen, Heretic, Half-Life, Blood, Redneck Rampage, and I believe Chasm the Rift. Recently, I have finally gotten around to playing through the third and final episode, having already completed the first two some months beforehand. Developed by David Szymanski and published by New Blood Interactive for Microsoft Windows, Mac, Linux, and the Nintendo Switch, the game also features music by Andrew Hulshult, who was also responsible for compositions in Rise of the Triad and Brutal Doom, as well as many others. As of January 2019, it was announced by Dusk's producer Dave Oshry that the game would, in due course, be receiving console versions, a physical PC release, and additional free content which will include a co-op mode, New Game Plus, and mod support. When looking at starting the single-player game, you first have the option to begin an episode of your choice, or alternatively a specific level. Aside from the main campaign, there is also an endless game feature available, which is an arena-style challenge where you face wave upon wave of enemies. And finally, there is also Dusk World, Dusk's multiplayer, which allows you to battle against other players in a deathmatch mode. Though I must admit that I have yet to try this out, as online gaming is something I seldom do these days. Attention to detail is most certainly evident in Dusk's options, most notably the inclusion of a frame rate cap, a field of view slider, a pixelization option for those wanting to experience the look of the original first-person shooter, and something that I wish more game developers would include in the menu, is an explanation of what a given selection actually does. Yes, I appreciate and would hope that some of these are self-explanatory, but for a majority of gamers out there, myself included, a little extra detail is most helpful when trying to make a decision. The audio options available seem quite satisfactory and feature the usual master and music volume sliders. Anything additional here would likely be surplus to requirements anyway. Several difficulty options are on offer to the player, as well as an alternative mechanic called Intruder Mode. This allows you to begin each level with only the starting weapon, the sickles, if you so wish. Players beginning their first run-through of the game might prefer to experience a normal or medium difficulty by electing to go with I Can Take It. That is what I almost always choose for a first run-through of any game, though next time I very likely will opt for Zero Mido, which equates to hard skill. I've frequently heard people say that the storyline associated with these kinds of games is largely irrelevant, and to a certain extent I can understand why this is said. Personally, I always like to take an interest and read about a game's background, no matter how predictable or one-dimensional it may seem. Our story begins in the rural town of Dusk, somewhere in Pennsylvania. Ruins have been discovered beneath farmland, and this attracts the attention of the authorities. An effort is made by the government to investigate this discovery, but not long after, military and research personnel fall prey to a demonic invasion. As the game's protagonist, you take on the role of intruder, an adventurer keen to exploit the area for unearthed treasures. Your experience begins with you having been taken prisoner and then subsequently brought to a farmhouse where some former townsfolk, now possessed, immediately lumber towards you. Another reference to the early shooters is unlocking areas via the acquisition of different coloured keys. This is a commonly seen characteristic in older first-person shooters, but it's still one that I enjoy to this day. Along the way, while battling numerous enemies throughout hostile environments, you will, no doubt, come across secrets which will provide additional items and ammo to help you on your journey. On my first run-through of a first-person shooter, I tend not to spend too much time looking for them, as I'm quite happy to leave some for another day. The enemies you will encounter range from robed cultists, scarecrows, demonic animals, and possessed humanoids. To help you deal with these fiendish creations, you have the aforementioned dual-wielded sickles, pistol and single-barrel shotgun, both of which can also be dual-wielded, double-barrel shotgun, an assault rifle, a hunting rifle, a crossbow which clearly takes influence from Heretic and Hexen, a mortar which acts like a grenade launcher, a riveter otherwise known as the rocket launcher, and last but not least, a magic sword, which I particularly liked the inclusion and design of. And with reference here to the weapons, the majority feel and sound solid when fired. It wasn't any of them that I found to be conspicuously weak, though on reflection maybe the crossbow and mortar sounded somewhat timid when used, but perhaps that's a little more understandable where the crossbow is concerned. Among my personal favourites were the double-barreled shotgun and hunting rifle. This first episode, The Foothills, is mainly set in rural environments such as cornfields, sawmills, barnyards, swamps and the like, whereas the second, The Facilities, features industrial-themed levels and includes adversaries like turned scientific personnel. The third and final chapter, The Nameless City, leads you into an alternate reality. An even greater variety of surreal and bizarre locations await before you are confronted by the cult leader, Jacob, and very shortly afterwards, the second and final boss, which I have to confess I was not expecting. Although I have seldom been one of the boss fights in games, possibly placing me in the minority, I thought both of these closing battles were rather well implemented. At the very end, before you can finally destroy the main boss, a demonic power is donated to you, presumably corrupting the protagonist, thus resulting in you taking the place as the newly crowned leader. It leaves us with a possible open ending which could serve as a suitable point for future content. I'll now touch on one part of the game design which I found to be more of a mixed bag. However, think of this as not a case of right or wrong, but instead a subjective observation. Of course, your own mileage might vary. Although nothing related to the limitations of the retro look employed, I did find some of the enemy model designs to be somewhat forgettable, and to a lesser extent, the setting for part of the first episode just didn't appeal to me all that much, whereas in contrast, I preferred the artistic direction of the second and particularly third episode. Interestingly, although I found Part 3 contained more high points than the previous two sections, I did also experience a bit more in the way of negatives too. An example being the altered perspective that we occasionally saw in the game. It is especially prevalent in the level Homecoming, which I found to be an intriguing yet rather frustrating experience. Of course, I appreciate that this is part of the challenge and reason behind the design, but maybe it went on for a bit too long for me and perhaps once too often. Now to sum up the highlights. Dusk's strengths range from excellent pacing and, as already said, great variety, particularly in the level design of the final episode. Striking use of lighting is distinctly evident throughout and serves to breathe life into the game world. At times I found myself just stopping for a few moments, soaking up the dreamlike surreal world I was immersed in. Quite possibly Dusk's greatest, most consistent strength is in its musical composition and game audio. Andrew Hulshult has contributed an array of music tracks which should cater to a wide audience. For your tastes, there is heavy rock as well as the more surreal ambient pieces, which are almost always my first choice when it comes to music in video games. I also like the way small references to other games such as Quake are dropped in here and there, like when a message appears telling the player that this door is opened elsewhere. Another is the name of the third episode, The Nameless City. Veterans of Quake will probably know what I'm referring to here. Finally, the attention to detail widely seen in the game world such as the ability to interact with some objects added a nice touch which, if I'm honest, I wasn't expecting to the degree that is evident at times. Put simply, this game oozes charm. To sum up, any first-person shooters coming through which manage to embody even just a modest level of the elements that have made the older favourites into such classics, unsurprisingly, will likely appeal to future audiences, and as far as I'm concerned, Dusk certainly hits the mark. Well, that pretty much wraps it up for me on this one. If you're a fan of first-person shooters, particularly those from the mid-90s onwards, then this is without a doubt one you should pick up. So I'd like to thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing for more content like this, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
My pet.